Part 4. Lacan and the plural logic of the Aporia. Lacan's complex theoretical edifice, like Freud's, is developed from a heady mix of clinical observation, theoretical speculation, and his appropriation of a vast array of literary and philosophical texts. Moreover, as Fink notes, his notions are shaped and reshaped in the course of his career, necessitating a choice between presenting them developmentally or structurally. Some, he remarks, will no doubt find a structural account overly static and closed, one of the many fascinations of his work lying precisely in its constant transformations, self-corrections, and reversals of perspective. One like Fink, however, I have elected nevertheless to provide a synchronic cut of Lacanian theory, for this approach is better suited to the purpose of demonstrating that the plural logic of the Aporia functions as a generalizable, useful heuristic for interpreting what Lacan has to say about the transcendental relation, the ethics of psychoanalysis, and intersubjective power relations in the seminar on the Purloined Letter. As with my treatment of Derrida's texts, I offer no pretense of a comprehensive survey of Lacan's daunting textual labyrinth, believing this to be as intrinsically impossible as reading the whole of Joyce. In any case, Lacan's surrealist strategy of composition allows one some license to build up an account of Lacanian psychoanalysis from fragments, and my exposition involves less a progression of ideas than a layering, each lamination adding detail and tone to the same interpretative skeleton, which I have derived from Derrida's plural logic of the Aporia. I shall engage 283 directly with some of Lacan's texts, but much of my account of the Lacanian version of the plural logic of the Aporia can be seen as a sustained engagement with Koplik's Lacan, as set out in Imagine There's No Woman. In Chapter 10, I address Lacan's complex articulation of the transcendental relation. Lacan offers an overwhelming variety of schemas, models, formulas, mathemes, and diagrams, which cover greater or smaller aspects of this relation. These may be helpful to those of a certain intellectual temperament but alienating to others. Favoring more concrete metaphorics over mathematical symbolization, I have taken the articulated imagos that appear in his early essays as an orienting amateur to explain the Gödelian structure of the transcendental relation. These also serve to emphasize that other humans are the primary and most significant objects or others implicated in the constitution of the subject in the transcendental relation. The other, which takes the three generalized forms of Nebenmensch, alter egos, and speaking others, is not a neutral, inert object. It is not merely touched, but it touches back with a shaping power of its own, teaching infants, through an encouraging or prohibiting circulation of desire, a certain version of reality. In Lacan's early essays, these generalized or structural forms of the other are associated with three imagos that take their names from traditional family figures, and the transcendental relation is described as an articulated amateur of three subject-object complexes associated with the maternal, fraternal, and paternal imagos. 2. One does not have to retain these traditional names, and Lacan would be the first to agree that various actual individuals of different sexual orientations may fill the roles of Nebenmensch, alter ego, or speaking other. Following Koplik, I have tended to substitute the Nebenmensch complex for the maternal imago, but I have retained the fraternal complex on the assumption that fraternity these days can be pressed beyond the connotations of brotherhood. I have also retained the paternal complex as a reminder of the patriarchal residue still inscribed in the symbolic order. Names aside, I shall follow Lee in holding that the family complexes of Lacan's early writings offer a metaphorical organization that, while certainly subject to refinement, elaboration, and modification in the lengthy course of his investigations, remains a productive and orientating heuristic for understanding the complexities of his account of the transcendental relation. 3. By using these structural metaphors, Lacan is at pains to point out that subjective development is not shaped by instincts but by complex imaginary constructs that inaugurate drives. 4. In other words, what shapes subjectivity are basic, impersonal structural complexes that remain constant. 284 No matter how they are concretized. Moreover, individuals respond to the demands of these complexes without necessarily being consciously aware of them. An infant has yet to develop the means for critical self-reflection, but in adults the force of unconscious habituation is difficult to resist because the inertial death drive works to resist novelty and change. Finally, although the imagos do appear at successive junctures in human development, they are not developmental stages that are passed through. 5. Instead, each complex may be viewed as a lamination that successively adds complexity and depth to Lacan's notion of the subject. Accordingly, I shall treat these complexes separately, showing in turn how each may be read according to the three moments of the plural logic of the Aporia before entering the dense thickets. However, it may be helpful to construct an aerial map, so to speak, of their articulation. A Lacanian account of the transcendental relation, according to Koplik, begins from the claim that the other does not exist and that the subject is constituted from an origin. Relax 6. This is not an argument for the absence of either but for the aporitic structure of each. In fact, Lacan conceives of a multiple and castrated, split, other, in relation to which a similarly multiple and castrated subject is constituted. Subject first of all to a spectral analysis of the other in terms of the real, imaginary, and symbolic orders, for which the Borromean knot stands as a graphic figure. 7. Lacan theorized subjectivity as an articulation of three subject-other complexes. First, within the Nebenmensch complex, in the register of the real, the lacking /desiring I is constituted in its relation to the primordial other defined as the object of the drive. 8. Second, within the fraternal hall of mirrors, in the register of the imaginary, the constitution of the subject as ego, or MOI, occurs in relation to the other as alter ego, the mirror image, siblings, the Oedipal parents, and other significant others. Third, the constitution of the subject as active, speaking JE, in opposition to the described or spoken MOI, occurs in relation to the impersonal, generalized other of discourse or culture, inscribed in language, in the register of the symbolic. This would be the paternal complex in a patriarchy. These three complexes, which already make for a plural subject, are not gathered together as a unified and ordered plurality. Instead their articulation remains aporitic, for they are mutually incompatible and antagonistic. But the aporitic entanglement does not end here, for there is a further complexity. In all three complexes the other is not only multiple but castrated or, that is, split by an aporitic or antagonistic disseminality and structurally unable, therefore, to form a whole. Yet we are libidinally driven, by means of the death drive, precisely to attempt the reconstruction of the other as the lost primordial whole, to which a return is in principle possible. Attempts to grasp the other as that toward which the drive drives are, in turn, split across an aporitic multiplicity, that is, the other is reconstructed as a closed totality, an open infinity, or a paradoxical open-endedness, whereby the other is sublimated or compounded by my very attempt to grasp it. All three conceptions, as Derrida has shown, are impossible, traumatic, because they harbor different kinds of Aporias. This division in the other is matched on the subject side of the transcendental relation by a split along the lines of incompatible libidinal responses to the primary castration of the other, divided in terms of sexual difference. For Lacan, importantly, sexual difference is not in the first instance a biological, binary, or gender, differential, distinction. 9 Instead, it describes three structurally incompatible ways of organizing the sexual drives that are elicited in response to the aporitic impossibility of the desired object /other, which is ultimately the narcissistic desire for immortality. While he calls these incompatible libidinal styles of organization masculine and feminine, he argues that biological men or women may organize their libidinal drives under the banner of either and can accordingly be unconsciously dominated by, or consciously give preference to, any libidinal style. 10. It is important to note, then, that when he speaks of masculine or feminine sexuality, he does not intend any essentialist argument concerning the sexual nature of biological men or women. Rather, masculine sexuality names the structure of a paranoid organization of the libidinal drives well suited to ideological interpellation, whose binary counterpart is a feminine hysterical organization. By contrast, the other feminine sexuality names a transgressive organization of the libidinal drives ill suited to ideological interpellation. It is worth repeating that ideological interpellation and the two forms of transgression just described are, for Lacan, universal structures, which are only named, respectively, masculine and feminine in a patriarchal culture. To return to the task of mapping the transcendental relation, it is important to emphasize here that, for Lacan, the paranoid and hysterical libidinal styles represent impossible extremes, and a fixation to one or the other means that the death drive, in either one of its opposing moments of paranoiac, return and hysterical destruction, has gained the upper hand. Accordingly, one may derive from the Lacanian text an oppositional relation in each of the three above-mentioned subject other complexes between masculine paranoia and feminine hysteria, whose logic of articulation is, once again, the veil of alienation as a consequence of its loose logic. To reiterate, Lacan shares Derrida's conviction that there is 286 no choosing for either side of this kind of opposition, and that it is possible, indeed important, to develop the third option that escapes the lethal pitfalls of either. One finds, therefore, not only an economic and an economic subject-object relation in each complex but also a third, paradoxical libidinal style, which Lacan prefers, as does Derrida, for it is in this feminine modification that Lacan finds room for the ethically able subject aimed at in psychoanalytic treatment. In some respects, this three-way structure may seem to be an imposition, for Lacan's intellectual strategy is not always precisely aligned with the plural logic of the Aporia, and he as often as not contrasts a masculine economic style with the third, paradoxical style, which he calls feminine, allowing the uneconomic position, which is also feminine but in its more lethal aspect, to slip into the wings. 11. But even when he shifts directly from a rejection of the masculine forward/conservative death drive to the feminine libidinal style associated with the acknowledgement of paradox, he is emphatic that this shift should not lose itself to the extreme of atomistic dissolution and dispersal, which reflects the other side of the death drive. I have therefore made space for an economic, feminine death drive for the sake of a clearer view of the basis upon which he rejects the opposing extremes named by masculine paranoia and feminine hysteria and works toward an articulation of the non-lethal feminine style. In accordance with the plural logic of the Aporia, in sum, each of the three self-other complexes that for Lacan constitute the transcendental relation are in turn subject to a traumatic split between economic, uneconomic, and paradoxical Aporias. In Chapter 10, I read the Nebenmensch complex according to this proposed schema in a fair amount of detail, because it prepares the way for Lacan's radicalizing reinterpretation of Freud's understanding of both fraternal and paternal relations. I do not address the fraternal and paternal complexes in as much detail, but I briefly sketch out a reading of each along the lines of the plural logic of the Aporia, leaving it to the laminating effect of the following chapters, which deal broadly speaking with ethics and power, to add some of the texture and tone. Notably, across all three libidinal styles, the subject's entry into the symbolic order, thematist in terms of the paternal complex, is understood in terms of active appropriation of, as Fink puts it, making one's own something that was formerly alien. 12. In this case, according to Fink, a complete reversal occurs vis-a-vis the other's desire, for the individual assumes responsibility for what had previously been experienced as an external, extraneous cause, a foreign roll of the dice. At the beginning of one's universe, destiny in other words, the J is required to become the subject of his or her own fate. Not it happened to me but I saw, I heard, I acted. 13. Hence the gist of Lacan's multiple translations of Freud's were swore, sol ich wooden, where the other pulls the strings, acting as my cause, I must come into being as my own cause. 14. In Chapter 11, I shall elaborate on the theme of action and its implications for Lacan's psychoanalytic account of ethical action. In outline, I shall show that the masculine J, formed via rejection of castration, dominated by the death drive as return, and bound by the stereotypes of an existing order, operates from a position of ideological paranoia, whereby his lot is the fixated action of an obedient functionary of the externally imposed law. In contrast, the feminine J, formed via wholesale acceptance of castration, dominated by the death drive as dissolution, and bound to smash up existing stereotypes, operates from a position of hysterical transgression, whereby her lot is the paralysis of pure destruction. Beyond these two libidinal styles, related in terms of the veil of alienation, which articulates castration and anti-castration, Lacan derives a third style, namely one of inventive sublimation. This style, which invokes the Aporia of a paradoxical interweaving of inventive and destructive action, is the key to Lacan's account of ethical action, and, notably, to his resolution of the antinomy Freud faced between sex and civilization. This account of ethical action lays the basis for the final chapter of this study, which explains Lacan's claim that the task of psychoanalytic intervention is ethical. If psychoanalysis aims to engender an ethically able subject, it presupposes the desirability of feminine sublimation as one of the intrinsic possibilities of the transcendental relation. But this is not to suggest that realizing the capacity for such sublimation is automatic, rather, it must be achieved. If Lacan criticizes psychoanalysis for setting itself up to produce ideologically adapted rather than ethically able subjects, he also chastises psychoanalysts for forgetting the fundamental tool of the trade, namely language. Psychoanalysis is not for nothing dubbed the talking cure. His emphasis on the interventionist value of speaking underscores a second feature of the subject's entry into the symbolic order, namely that, again across all three libidinal styles, the formation of the J is a matter of learning to speak. As Lee notes, psychoanalysis situates the development of the Oedipus complex at precisely the period in which children are most effectively acquiring the language of their parents, beginning from about the age of 2.5 years. For Lacan, successful negotiation of Oedipal conflicts is quite literally a matter of learning to speak properly. 15. Precisely what this means and how it is tied to questions of ethics and power will be addressed in Chapter 12, with the help of Lacan's Seminar 288 on the purloined letter. I shall merely note here that for Lacan, again read in accordance with the plural logic of the Aporia, speech on the one hand may be what he calls empty, that is, unaware of the unconscious conditions, rules of the game, that determine its character. Such empty speech manifests as fixated on either the rule of law or the law of exception. On the other hand, in what he calls full speech, the individual gains analytical insight into the logic named by the veil of alienation and in so doing occupies an anomalous or paradoxical position between the rule and its outside, which is precisely the displacement from which one must risk decisive action. To read Lacan's Seminar on the purloined letter in terms of the plural logic of the Aporia poses a direct challenge to Derrida's reading of this text, which sees in it only confirmation that Lacan is too at home with a traditional philosophy caught up in the metaphysics of presence. To conclude this study, then, I shall address the specifics of Derrida's unjust reading of this seminar, detailed in Le Facte de la Vie, right, from out of which his protocols for reading Lacan emerge. With the help of Barbara Johnson's seminal essay The Frame of Reference, I shall assess the possibility of nevertheless finding something of value to be gained from what is unquestionably a one-sided misrecognition of Lacan's theoretical strategy. 16 If it is easy enough for me to outline a viable form of theoretical accord between Derrida and Lacan based on the plural logic of the aporia, it is highly unlikely that Derrida would have missed this. I agree with Barbara Johnson that he is too astute a reader not to have framed Lacan on purpose. Moreover, if one returns to the scene of the rift between them, Derrida's reading of Lacan's seminar on the purloined letter, it is easy to see where, in order to build up the case that 8 tightly interwoven motifs in this seminar place Lacan squarely within the metaphysics of presence, Derrida reduces only to its economic moment everything that for Lacan has the paradoxical ambiguity given to it by the third moment of the plural logic of the aporia. In other words, Derrida decides the undecidable in Lacan, which is highly ironic, since this is exactly the mistake many make when reading Derrida, although they tend to decide the undecidable in the other direction. Barbara Johnson insists that Derrida does this intentionally as a kind of lesson in rhetoric. But if this is so, he never comes clean later on about the setup. However, whatever Derrida's motivations concerning Lacan may be, the lesson in rhetoric remains a valuable demonstration of how easy it is to miss the point in confronting the plural logic of the aporia. To decide the undecidable one way or the other will be to misread both Derrida and Lacan.